I'm Francis Levy. I'm co-director of Philip Tatey Center, and welcome to The Origin of Freud's Imagination. I am now pleased to introduce Robert Paul. Robert Paul is Dean of Emory College and Candler Professor of Anthropology and Interdisciplinary Studies. Dr. Paul will moderate this afternoon's panel and introduce the other panelists. So I give you Robert Paul.
Thank you very much. The topic is the origin of Freud's imagination. Few people have influenced the contemporary imagination the way Freud has, but Freud himself stood at the confluence of a vast array of influences which have now been explored for many years by scholars. He, of course, was a scientist, but also extremely well educated, knew all the modern European as well as the ancient languages, and was very well read in the literature, philosophy, and knew about the other arts of his time. And he brought all those things together in his mind and created the synthesis that then influenced our imagination. So what we thought we would do in this panel was to bring together a number of people who have different expertise in different realms of the imagination and explore some of these strands and how they came together with with Freud. So, were you signaling to me?
No, I'm not.
Okay. I didn't think I'd said anything that controversial. I was asked to suggest a topic to this group, and the topic that came to my mind looking at the expertise that is arrayed before us, which I just put on the table, it doesn't necessarily have to dictate what we do, is the theme of Athens and Jerusalem, which is a shorthand way of talking about the fact that European civilization, through Christianity, incorporates two very different strands of thought, that of revelation versus reason, that of a non-Western Semitic culture, and that of the Western, what we call the Western culture. And of course, this is a tension that has both permeated Western civilization, has been an enormous source of imaginative productivity, and has also been a source of tremendous conflict. And of course, Freud lived at one of the dramatic moments of that encounter. And the question of where did Freud stand in all of this, it seems to me, is an interesting one. The question, obviously, he had a good education. He knew the classical languages. He was a child of the Enlightenment and declared himself a scientist and a Darwinian. But then there's the question of the fact that Freud was a Jew, and how much of a Jew, just what sort of a Jew was he? And that's a highly controversial question. The question of was Talmudic thought an element in his imagination and his thinking? How much of his thinking is influenced by the Hebrew tradition, and for that matter, the Yiddish tradition? How far removed was he from Yiddish culture, which of course was the dominant Jewish culture of Eastern European Jews, where his parents ultimately derived from. So these were cultural trends that didn't get along all that well, and of course, as we know, as it ended in Freud's life, came to a terrible and tragic end in the relationship between that within German culture, or broadly speaking, European culture. But it's worthwhile, it seems to me, to just use this as a beginning topic, and I hope that the conversation will branch out more generally. What I would like to do by way of a format is ask each of our four panelists to speak for 5 or 10 minutes, make an opening statement, then ask that they respond to each other's comments for a little while, and then sooner or later, I'm sure this audience will be poised to begin a general group discussion. We're very fortunate to have a distinguished and, as I said, a varied panel of specialists, beginning with Richard Armstrong, who is Associate Professor and Director of the Program in Classical Studies at the University of Houston, where he's also a Fellow of the Honors College. He works on the reception of ancient culture with a special focus on psychoanalysis and is the author of a book just published 2006, A Compulsion for Antiquity, Freud and the Ancient World. Mary Bergstein, who is professor of art history in the field of art and architectural history and now chair of the Department of Art History at the Rhode Island School of Design, author of several books on art history, but perhaps most relevant for this one is working on a current book, Mirrors of Memory, Freud, Proust, Photography, and Art. Mark Edmundson is Daniel's Family Distinguished Teaching Professor of Romantic Poetry and Literary Theory at the University of Virginia. He is the author of numerous books, of which I will mention only one that pertains on the topic of today's discussion, which is Towards Reading Freud, Self-Creation in Milton, Wordsworth, Emerson, and Sigmund Freud, and has publications and honors too numerous to mention here. And lastly, my pleasure to introduce Professor Ethan Kleinberg, who took his PhD from UCLA and is currently Associate Professor of History and Letters at Wesleyan University and Associate Editor of History and Theory. His first book was the winner of the Journal of the History of Ideas Morris D. Forkosh Prize for the best book in intellectual history, and is completing his, Generation Existential, Martin Heidegger's Philosophy in France, and is currently working on a second book, The Myth of Emmanuel Levinas. So he and is presenting a paper at the upcoming conference on Freud's Jewish world in Levinas and Freud, Talmud and Psychoanalysis before the letter. So you can see we have a wide range of expertise and a number of different fields represented here, and I will just, as I've introduced the panelists in alphabetical order, I will just ask them to make an opening statement beginning with Professor Armstrong.
Thank you. I don't know if there's a seat. Thank you all for coming. I've been receiving the newsletters from the center, and I'm very impressed with the regular sort of discussions going on here. Although I do feel right now that I'm playing celebrity poker or something. It's kind of hard not to see you all as I talk. I also have to admit, as a classicist, when I saw the title Philoctetes Center, I assumed it was a center for the treatment of chronic pain. You know about the hero with his festering wound on the island of Lemnos. We actually refer to him in the classics field as a joke as Puss in Boots. I'm sorry for that. But sorry, bad way to begin. At any rate, I'm very interested, obviously, in Freud's interest in the ancient world. I called it a compulsion for antiquity. Well, I share that compulsion, so obviously you can see where my passion comes from. But, you know, when we think of Athens and Jerusalem, and we think of 19th century Vienna and what we might call the drama of assimilation, you know, the conflict aspect, the conflictual aspect of identity, being a Jew growing up in Vienna, going to a classical high school, we often think of Athens versus Jerusalem. And one of the things that I'm interested in is the ways in which we might talk about Athens in Jerusalem, which is the title of a very good book by Yakov Shavit, massive sort of study, about the importance of the encounter with Hellenism and Greek culture in general for the development of secular Jewish identity. And so that's one of the things that I'm sort of interested in because, in fact, I see a lot of nuances there. Just to give you one example, when Freud went to Athens, I don't know how many of you have read that wonderful letter talking about his experience of derealization when he stood on top of the Acropolis. This was in 1904, and he was there with his brother, and he had this feeling that suddenly it was unreal. Well, it's interesting. That actually was a common experience, and it had a lot to do with the fact that there was a huge investment among all educated people, you might say, especially in the German-speaking world, in the sort of Greek ideal. In fact, there are a number of people who would go and feel this strange sense of derealization or disappointment even when confronted with what they were looking at. But what I think is interesting is Freud puzzled over this experience for a great many years until finally he did analyze it in a letter. It was dedicated to Romain Rolland, which actually gives it an interpretation that you might see showing something years after the fact of that drama of assimilation, in the sense of he realized that he and his brother had gone farther than their father in going to Athens, and that Athens would not have meant much to him because he says he did not have a gymnasium or classical education as he did, but of course you might also see it as, recognizing that to his Jewish father, Athens would not have meant as much, although that's not, explicitly what he says. Well, what's interesting, though, is the way he resolves that feeling is by giving it an Oedipal interpretation. Again, the Oedipus complex being something so keenly tied into Greek myth, obviously, and also Hamlet, since Oedipus the King and Hamlet are both the plays that are so significant since the very first formulation of this Oedipus complex. So what you see there is the difficulty. On the one hand, we'd like to kind of perform a simple drama of identity, right? That as a Jew in Athens, feeling very excited about it, suddenly he has a kind of crisis of guilt vis-a-vis his father and his Jewish ancestry. But in fact, the resolution of that in his own mind is more complex, and one that again shows you how the intellectual heritage that is so much a part of his secular scientific identity, you might say, is how he even interprets the very nature of that conflict. I'll be speaking on Monday, in fact, about the whole issue of education in the gymnasium system, the 8-year classical school that was the gateway to higher education in Vienna and most of the German-speaking world. Because what interests me about Vienna, and what's very different in the 19th century, is how many Jewish students were in these schools. In fact, they were tremendously overrepresented as a group. And in Freud's case, it's very, very, very striking, because by the time he graduated, the majority of students in the school were in fact Jewish, so they were being acculturated to the classics and to German culture, reading the Schiller and the Goethe, in the company of many other Jews. They had Jewish religion courses being taught. He had a very good friendship with Samuel Hammerschlag, his Jewish religion teacher. And this was in Leopoldstadt, the largest Jewish part of Vienna. So it gives you a feeling that it's very different than if he had gone to perhaps one of the British public schools or something and had felt very much a fish out of water. And I think that conditions a lot how the secular Jewish identity that's being developed there in the gymnasium, and these are young men who will go on to the liberal professions of science, for example, or journalism, etc. They will all go through this interesting period of classical education and take that forward in a trajectory that is different from their Gentile contemporaries in a sense. So I think as a classicist, that's personally what interests me a great deal, is to begin to look at that separate sort of trajectory, even though they're reading similar texts. And let me give you an example. You might know something of Freud's fascination with the figure of Hannibal. This is something he talks about in the interpretation of dreams. He had, as a boy, a kind of passionate, intense interest in the figure of Hannibal, because Hannibal was, of course, the terror of Rome. And feeling surrounded by this sort of anti-Semitic climate in Vienna, his sense was that, this is the kind of figure that would serve as a kind of good model for that sort of tenacious, kind of resistance. But what's interesting about that is, again, this is not a question of even Carthage versus Rome, because if you look at in that passage, I don't know how many of you remember that from the interpretation of dreams, but it's kind of an awful passage in many ways, because what got him interested in Hannibal was his disappointment in his own father. His father is trying to tell him, and I assume that this conversation takes place in the late 1860s, that, things are much better, he's saying, because when I was a young man, walking down the street, a Christian came and told me to get off the pavement and knocked my hat into the mud. And, Freud said, well, what did you do? And he said, I picked up my hat, and went on. And that he was greatly disappointed by his father's behavior. And that this is where in the text he then says, more to my liking was the idea of, again, Hannibal and his father having him, swear eternal enmity with Rome, right? So what you see there is an interesting case in point of a kind of triangulation. On the one hand, you feel his disappointment in his father and his sense of sort of alienation. He's a young Jewish boy growing up in Vienna in an era of a sort of moment where a liberal government is giving him not only access to education, but belief that he will have a brighter future or more of a kind of influence in society. He feels disappointed with his father, and so he picks up Hannibal, who is in fact, the figure that many students, regardless of their religious affiliation, would have identified with. This was well known among gymnasium teachers. Why do you always spend a lot of time on Hannibal? Well, he's the underdog. You know, all students love Hannibal. But Freud, very obviously, as a young Jewish boy, loved Hannibal for different reasons, right? That it was the fact that he was a Semite, but a Semite of a different order, you know, a sort of killer Semite, and not just one who had, through, you know, a long kind of coexistence with a hostile kind of Christian dominant culture, felt the need to, again, have this sort of deference. So that, to me, points out, and I talk about other things like this in the book that I've written, how we have to kind of think of the space of classical education in particular as a third something between the Christian dominant culture and Jewish tradition, a space for sort of remaking oneself. And this really, to be honest, is not that different for young Christian students as well, because, in fact, there are plenty of people who are fascinated by the pagan aspects of antiquity, which speak to their own struggle or their own search for sexual identity, political freedom, or, you know, many other such causes. So the trajectories, again, are very different, and I'm just specifically fascinated by the Jewish trajectories, which I think, frankly, have been a little understudied. So let me just conclude by saying, if there is a matter of identity, a drama of identity between Athens and Jerusalem in this regard, in the life of Freud, it's very much an ongoing one. The dialogue is an open one. It requires a certain openness to the past that responds to such things as the rise of, you know, obviously Nazism, which, you know, conditions an interest in the figure of Moses in Jewish tradition. So, you know, in that sense, you can't reduce it to one thing. But more than a matter of identity, it's also very importantly a matter of methodology. And this is something that I've probably gone at greatest length in my book to talk about, which is, it's not just figures of the ancient world, like Hannibal and Alexander, but also the very study of the ancient world that conditions greatly a lot of what he wants to do with the study of the human mind in the past, in that sense. And so, you know, part of the richness of this dialogue, in other words, is not just seeking suitable heroes, which is, you know, the impulse as a young man, but also finding an entire, you might say, attitude of openness and excavation toward the past. And so all these analogies that drive the development of psychoanalysis, of excavation, for example, of critical historiography, the use of myth and the analysis of myth to sort of see what, you know, underlying, you know, realities are there. All of this is part of a kind of complex mixture of things in that regard, in which, you know, Athens and Jerusalem, Carthage and Rome, and I suppose we definitely did also talk about Egypt, are all put into a given dialogue. So maybe I should hold off there.
Thanks very much.
Firsthand.
Professor Bergstein.
Hi, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. Coming from history of art and visual culture, I'm most interested in the origins of Freud's visual imagination. In 1995, a book entitled Reading Freud's Readings, edited by Sandra Gilman and others, was published to the claim that nothing is more revealing about a person than what he reads. Specialists on that project from a range of areas, from the history of medicine, from literary studies, from the history of classical scholarship, spent 2 months working on questions raised by Freud's reading and his library at the Freud Museum in London. The result, Reading Freud's Reading, is a kind of guided tour of Freud's intellectual tools, so to speak. In my view, the same kind of investigation is owed to Freud's visual resources, a kind of looking at Freud's images, and not just works of art. Freud theorized the visual. He saw images as the medium of desire and fantasy and dreams. And Didier, Amsieux, and others, many others, have written about Freud's special ability to move from the visual to the verbal. Dream analysis, for example, moves from the visual to the verbal. Now, how do we look into Freud's visual imagination? First, we know that he collected works of art, and so we know which works of art he spent day in and day out with. Then there were images in books from his childhood. There were, for example, a botanical monograph, the Philipson Illustrated Bible, which was very important to Freud. But what my special interest is here is photographs in printed books. Primed Freud's imagination for his Italian experience, for one thing, his interpretation of Jensen's Gradiva, and especially his visualization of mythological forms. These photos were replicated in publications and replicated over and over again in archaeological and art historical publications, and they were made to be pored over in a very private process of studying, reading. They were absorbed as easily as the written text. And they were also made to persist in memory. They were aides memoire, and they were made to refresh the memory again and again. People like Emmanuel Levy, who was Freud's good friend, who was an ancient art historian at the Sapienza in Rome. Emmanuel Levy was one of the first to assemble a library, a fototeca, at the Sapienza at the University of Rome, and a plaster cast collection as well, and worked with those in all of his books. So in documentary photography, to see, these were all received as documentary photographs, therefore very transparent, as though the viewer were looking at the real thing. In the pages of art history books Freud owned by scholars like Max Arem, Emmanuel Levy, Adolf Furtwängler, and others, were an abundance of sphinxes, eroi, and even a gorgeous Medusa swimming in the chiaroscuro of dreamlike non-reality. Furtwängler's Denkmäler griechischer und römischer Skulptur, Monuments of Greek and Roman Sculpture of 1904, with its very richly printed photographs, was a key image, a key bank of images in Freud's imagination. That's just one book out of many. And I have a case in point that I can return to. I'll be brief now, and then if anyone's interested I can describe the case in point. As far as Jerusalem versus Athens is concerned, Judaism is an aniconic religion prohibiting figurative art, and particularly prohibiting sculptured images of the deity, any deity. The Hebrew tradition was also fundamentally opposed to the institution of Greek athletic nudity and the glorification of the naked body, whether in life, that is to say military events or athletic games, or in art. So this is proclaimed in Jubilees, where the rabbis, for example, forbade the nudity and idolatry associated with Greek sport to the Jews. The rabbis say they should cover their shame and not undress themselves as the Gentiles, i.e. the Greeks, uncover themselves. The photographic material, however, in Freud's library archive was, of course, meant to be pored over and studied. So Freud came from the tradition of the people of the book. Study was a good thing. And in 19th century Vienna, in this post-Enlightenment environment that Richard was talking about, study towards scientific progress was always good. So these books were pored over with these photographs of, say, the Vatican Venus, to name just one, other statues like this, in an act as intimate as that of reading. And one might argue, perhaps, that nothing is more revealing about a person than the photographs he looks at in private, in leisure, he or she, and pores over and over and over again, just like reading. This way, the act of scientific study, scientific as in the term Wissenschaft, the post-Enlightenment Vienna, the act of scientific study trumped the Jewish taboo on figuration and trumped the Jewish taboo on Hellenic veneration of the nude. A way of seeing that was a source of fascination and cultural transcendence, again, as Professor Armstrong was saying, for assimilated Jews like Freud and his friends, his archaeologist friends, Emmanuel Levy and Ludwig Pollock, for example. And I just want to put in a plug for my own a publication that's coming out. I'm currently preparing a special issue of the journal Visual Resources devoted to visual documentation in Freud's Vienna, and that includes essays on, for example, Martin Gerlach's photographs, the photographs of nature that Martin Gerlach produced for designers and artists. There's an article on the decor of the Egyptian installation by Elfriede Haslauer, who's the Egyptian curator at the Kunsthistorisches Museum. Freud's travel photographs are featured in that, as well as our archaeological maps. Diane O'Donoghue has contributed an essay on Freud's idea of place through the archaeological maps that he was always looking over. Then there's an essay on scientific photographs in turn-of-the-century Vienna, with special attention to scientists like Julius Tandler, who was the founder of a kind of typology of physical types. And also, there's a wonderful contribution by Veronica Hofer about illustrations by the physiologist Sigmund Exner. And Exner was a wonderful draftsman, and he, in his article on the physiology of flight, which was human flight, which was very important at the time, has the illustrations from Exner's article are out of Exner's head, figures of God, the Eternal Father, the creating deity from the ceiling of the Sistina. So it's got a variety of subjects. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Edmundson.
Thanks. I'm very pleased to be invited to come back. It's a wonderful place, and it's great. I was very stimulated by Bobby Paul's thought that we would talk about Freud in relationship to Athens and Jerusalem, and I was stimulated and thought, and as stimulated as it was, I couldn't come up with a darn thing. So I decided I'd shuffle the deck just a little bit, and I hope in a way that proves illuminating, and talk a little bit about the relationship between maybe Jerusalem and Stratford, England, most specifically between Moses and Shakespeare, and the place that they might have served in the imaginative life of Freud. And I kind of break that down into a couple of parts. The first part is a kind of a weird part, and that is that Freud had what I at least take to be very strange ideas about the identities of both Moses and Shakespeare, and they run parallel to each other in a kind of intriguing way. As you probably all know, Freud was a proponent of the Earl of Oxford did it school. He believed, chiefly influenced by the book of a man rather unfortunately named Looney. Freud knew enough English to understand that and barrel through nonetheless. Freud was absolutely persuaded that Sigmund Freud, the actor and the glovemaker's son, could never have written those magnificent plays. He had to be an aristocrat. He had to be the Earl of Oxford. Similarly, Freud also thought that Moses couldn't possibly have been a commoner. He had to be an aristocrat. He had to come up from high up in Egyptian society. That to me, and in the contortions that he goes through in the beginning of Moses and Monotheism, a book I nonetheless love, in order to demonstrate that, seem trying even to the most sympathetic kind of reader. And I guess that my own reading of that, the kind of the more negative or regressive dimension of that engagement takes this form. Freud looks up ahead at Shakespeare and Moses, both of which I think he wants to emulate in consequential ways, and he says to himself, well, Shakespeare and Moses may both have been there before me, fair enough, but look, they were both aristocrats, you know? I, Sigmund Freud, I started from nothing, and I became something. So even though I was second, I did something that they didn't do. This is a kind of fantasia on the background of the thing, but there's a deeper intellectual dimension to it and a might call it a political dimension to the whole thing, too. You know, I think that Freud, in many ways, wanted to be Shakespeare's greatest critic. You know, he said the poets were there before me, and he wanted to look into a writer, the greatest writer ever, Shakespeare, and he wanted, as it were, to codify and make available in fairly abstract but nonetheless compelling terms what it is this writer knew intuitively. And the most prominent example of that, of course, is Hamlet. Harold Bloom says, I think quite rightly, that it could have been called the Hamlet complex as much as the Oedipus complex, and that's just a terrific piece of, of reading of Shakespeare. But I suspect not only that a number of other of Freud's ideas either were beckoned out of or were confirmed by reading of Shakespeare, but also there was an ambition on Freud's part to have as large and complex and varied and as accurate a sense of what he would quite confidently have called human nature as what Shakespeare did. But one of the things that I've sort of come to see in writing a book, as I'm trying to do now about the last 2 years of Freud's life, is that part of Freud's genius knew that being a genius was not enough. He looked back through German culture in the direction of two writers who, as confident as he was in his own powers, Freud probably would have said were at least in mental power his equal. And those were Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, who had their influence on him, to be sure. But neither of them had founded a movement. Neither of them had a real legacy. Neither of them had claims on the future. Neither of them could even keep or wanted to keep an academic job, right? In Moses, Freud saw many things, but but one of them was somebody who was an incredibly successful politician and institution builder. You know, the cards were stacked against him. Nonetheless, he found for himself a very small but devoted following. He kept them with him despite any number of trials, though to Freud they did in the end kill him, alas. Nonetheless, he was the person who was able to be not just an intellectual leader, but also a political, social leader, the sort of person who could get a movement going. Now, Moses is really important to Freud in an intellectual sense, too, and I'll just kind of gesture in this direction. It might be something we talk about. There are those kind of dismal pages at the beginning of Moses and Monotheism about the aristocratic identity of Moses, but to me they're made up for 5 times by the fabulous pages toward the end of the book on Moses' relationship to the doctrine of the invisible God. There's fabulous stuff that Freud tells us about how difficult it's got to be to make the jump from paganism, where you can actually see the gods, to this invisible and abstract God that was so hard to worship and that the Jews slid away from so many, many times. I have this speculation, you see if you think there's anything to it, but this speculation takes this form, that in a certain sense, what Freud thought was that Moses had taken this magnificent step in the right direction where he taught his followers to believe in an abstract God, and that would pave the way for believing in an abstract and invisible inner life, like the one that Freud described when he talked about the ego, the superego, and the id. Once you could do the invisible abstract thing, psychoanalysis became more possible. So from a detractor of religion, Freud becomes somebody who's maybe building up a genealogy that leads out of paganism toward Moses and the belief in the invisible God, toward Freud and the interest in the invisible psyche. Moses does another thing for Freud, too, that I think really interesting. One of the big tensions in Freud, and it gets back to Shakespeare a little bit, is that he's somebody who is constantly talking to us about the complexity of human life and human desire, about how we're not united individuals internally. We get different parts, and they're often at war with one another, and that it's very difficult to see us as consolidated beings. Yet when Freud presents himself in public, in his persona and in his writing, he's prone to present himself as a hyper-consolidated being, as an authority, as a great man, sometimes as the kind of leader that he describes in group psychology and the analysis of the ego. Freud's patriarchy in his self-presentation and his writerly presentation is antithetical to a major strain in his work, it seems to me, that would try to dismantle patriarchy and the lure of the father. I think, and this is a speculation we can check out if you want to, I think that he started to see in Moses somebody who was both a leader and not a conventional patriarch. You know? Somebody whose way of leading people, because he was able to express ambivalence in certain moments, was more consistent with the ethos of psychoanalysis than the other models of leadership that Freud had taken in and understood, but that were really inconsistent with his doctrine of the more complex psyche, the one that's less beholden to the leader and the superego. So those are just some kind of random thoughts about, not entirely random thoughts, believe me. It took some time to consolidate. But I guess, you know, we can maybe think about Jerusalem and London, about Shakespeare and Moses, and about that dual responsibility that Freud felt that he had, not just to give us this really complex and rich sense of what human beings are, but to make it last. And in trying to make it last, sometimes betraying the sense of complexity that he taught us to savor in the rest of his writing.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Professor Kleinberg.
Well, I'll be lucky if my random thoughts are so coherent. But first of all, I'd like to thank you for inviting me here and thank all of you for attending. It's with some trepidation that I bat clean up here after a lot has been said, and there certainly is a lot to think about. And so I've been moving in a lot of different ways. I was thinking initially precisely about imagination. And then somehow from imagination, I started thinking about images. And I started thinking about graven images, images of gods. And then I started thinking about the Phillipson Bible, which is precisely a Bible that also transgresses against the prohibition, because, of course, there are images in the Bible. And then from there, I followed along and started thinking about this great leap or advance forward in intellectuality that Freud speaks about in the book on Moses, where he talks about this moment of moving away from more pagan religions that are attached at some level to images or that need to have something there or have to have miracles, to a religion that's based entirely on an abstract concept, and an abstract concept that you cannot represent in any fashion. And that it's this moment, this is what Moses in fact gives to the Jewish people, that becomes their essence, becomes this essence of Judaism, this ability to think in this abstract conceptual way. But of course then that led me back again to this issue of Athens and Jerusalem, because when you think about, or I suppose when you go to Philosophy 101 and you're talking about abstract conceptual images that have nothing to do, say, with the transcendental, but in fact you're talking about trying to figure out ideas and thought in a conceptual way, you're usually talking about philosophy. And oftentimes it's presented starting with Athens and the Athenian school of philosophy. And I suppose what interests me most, to get back to imagination, is the way that Freud's able to take these twin poles of Athens and Jerusalem, which are posited as philosophy and religion, or reason and revelation, and often are considered as antagonistic, and is able to switch them. He's able to take Jerusalem and make it the foundation precisely of some sort of conditioning for abstract reason, the advance in intellectuality that thus can be the basis for reason going forth. Whereas then when you return to look at Jerusalem, well, Jerusalem does have philosophy, but it's linked in so many ways to pluralism and to paganism, and thus at this level it takes on the characteristics that had previously been ascribed precisely to Jerusalem, and he's able to do so. Now, it's interesting because it also relates to what he does with Shakespeare and with Moses, certainly. There's an element in Freud. If you read the Jewish historian Amos Funkenstein, he has a concept called counterhistory. And in this notion of counterhistory, what happens is you tell a history of a people, but in the telling, you subvert the original narrative so that, for instance, the character, in the telling of Moses, it turns out that Moses is not a Jew, but an Egyptian. And as it turns out, that it's the previous persecutor is now the hero who saves and brings the Jews forward. But if we are to believe Freud, and in fact the Jews or the Hebrews go on to kill Moses, it turns out that it's precisely the Hebrews who are somehow the oppressors who kill the Egyptian Moses. And you see how the whole thing's flipped around. And it's really an amazing movement that occurs, but it serves several purposes for Freud. And it does certainly come at a cost. The cost is, of course, that the onus is on Moses as the great man, precisely as the great man. And it's Moses' choice as a man to give the Hebrews this advance. It's not God's choice. And so you see religion has been removed from the equation, and instead it becomes the action of an individual human. Now, I suppose that's the bargain. Freud removes the religion and instead is able to place Freud in this, Moses, that's the greatest slip of all, Moses in this role. But of course, he's also placing himself in this role as being able to discover precisely the mechanism that Moses used. And then, of course, Moses was killed and replaced by a second Moses that allowed religion to slip back in. But here you have Moses becomes the authority or the progenitor of a new tradition, of a new school, as you say. Now, Freud isn't the only one doing something like this at the time, and there was a philosopher of the late 19th century named Hermann Cohen. And Hermann Cohen is a fascinating figure to me because if you looked at sort of who people were reading and who was the most prominent philosopher in the late 19th, early 20th century, it was in fact Hermann Cohen, although you'd be hard-pressed to find him taught in a philosophy or intellectual history class today. And Hermann Cohen was a neo-Kantian. And he was a neo-Kantian who had worked for a long time on trying to understand the principles of reason and of science as the most logical and the most compelling ways of approaching philosophical questions. Now, toward the end of his career, he writes a book called The Religion of Reason Out of the Sources of Judaism. And in The Religion of Reason Out of the Sources of Judaism, he in fact goes back to look at philosophy and look at the early texts of Judaism to make the case that no, it was not Athens that was the source of this reason, but in fact it comes out of the Jewish religion, and then in these moments of Hellenization and interaction, the two work together and move forward. But to really understand how philosophy works and to understand how reason works is to go back to the sources of Judaism. And so he does something very similar to what Moses is doing. Here we go again, to what Freud is doing. I know it's going to keep going on like this. I can tell it's going to get worse. Well, I suppose I'll leave it out there, sort of as it is, that there's this moment at the end of the 19th century where there is this great desire to return or reclaim, to find some place, if not for religion, for the essence of Judaism, in the modern understanding, not only of identity, but in the case of both Freud and Cohen, actually for a larger understanding of what it means for humanity and how this might, through psychoanalysis, or in Cohen's case through philosophy, might actually be spread in a way that can somehow lead to advances. It turns out to be, of course, a very, a deeply tragic moment too, because the attempt to reach out to the neighbor and to make this claim about the interaction and the ways that it relates to all humans, although certainly there seems to be a privileged place for the Jewish religion here, even when you take the religion out, this occurs right on the eve of what's going to be the greatest catastrophe for the Jewish people. And it's very interesting to think of them trying so hard with all their might in their last years, making this reconciliation and making this return. It's also interesting that younger thinkers of the same time, Levinas would be later, but also Benjamin or even Leo Strauss, be a little older, Franz Rosenzweig, are working through the same issues, but finding themselves led back to the transcendent category that must at some level be equated with God, that it's insufficient to only have the reason or only have the concept if you don't have some sort of external authority imperative to hang it on. So,
thank you very much. As I said before, I would first like to give the opportunity to our panelists to perhaps respond to all the very intriguing things that have been said. Anybody like to comment, please?
First question, isn't Moses acting like a father by getting himself killed? I mean, part of what's important in the text is the influence of Moses. The reason how he becomes a sort of foundational figure is by uncanny means, through the murder and the suppression of the murder. And part of what interests me about Freud's text, it really, is already there in his long essay on Jensen's Gradiva, but, you can see it happening time and time again, is there are really two different narratives going on. On the one hand, there's an analysis of the phenomenon of Moses or Jensen's Gradiva, but at the same time, there's a second story, a kind of meta-story, which is the story of psychoanalysis. And the interesting parallel track in Moses' monotheism is, while trying to explain, the sort of genesis and the structure and nature of Judaism, at the same time, again, the real truth that he constantly is instantiating and representing is the truth of psychoanalysis, which, by the end you can say they sort of come together. When he talks about that progress in intellectuality that is represented by the decisive step towards the abstract, and the reason why, again, the Jews can be sort of very proud of this highly intellectualized religion, it sort of shows that secret affinity that Jews have for psychoanalysis, not only psychoanalysis, but science in general. His sense that being historically less repressed vis-a-vis sexual matters, etc., they've had a greater affinity with psychoanalysis and this type of scientific truth. So again, you can kind of see those parallel lines of development. But to me, what's interesting in the plot is for Moses to be the influential figure that he is, he has to be murdered.
Yeah.
And so, whether you see this kind of projection of all this sense of hostility and anxiety, again, of having a movement, having rebellious sons and, crown princes like Jung, I think there's some validity to that in the figure of Moses, since it goes all the way back to the time of the essay of the Moses of Michelangelo. But, could you see that there still is a dynamic there in which he projects a kind of paternal
Yes.
Oedipal conflict.
Could I add just one thing to that? 'Cause it just occurred to me that you're absolutely right. Moses isn't just a father. Freud makes it quite clear that he's sort of the worst kind of a father because he's overbearing and he's incredibly strict and he asks of his children to do precisely what they cannot do. They're destined to fail. And of course, they have enormous resentment as a result.
And he awakens the memory of the primal father, too. So, I mean, in that sense, to play hammer to your anvil, there is an element there. I mean, I think there is a profound sense of identification with a figure that lasts many years. I think many would agree on that. But that paternal dynamic is still there. And I'm very intrigued by your reading because I do think there's an awful lot going on.
I think that there are two dimensions of Freud's relationship to Moses. And the first one is one that you put your finger on exactly. And that is that for Freud, Moses is a very conventional patriarch, right? And that he presents himself as what Lacan usefully calls le sujet supposé à savoir. He knows everything. He has special access to God. And in the end, his followers do to him what followers always do to these dictator figures. That is, they murder him, and he rises again in spirit to be the presiding figure of the religion. And that's one Freudian story about who Freud is and where he's going. Right? But I think that there's another question that's really deep in Freud's mind. It's something like this. What makes me as a leader different from somebody like Hitler? Right? From an authoritarian leader. And one of the things that he says in group psychology is that the oppressive leader, this is the one dimension of Moses we're talking about, all of his impulses flow in the same direction. Right? He's united within himself, and he speaks perfectly his desire. Right? Moses interests Freud not only because he can play that role, but also because he's somebody who is not only divided internally, but dramatizes the division. And it goes back to the first essay on Moses, the Michelangelo sculpture, where Freud rather outrageously bends the, to me, the intent of the sculpture and says, hey, Moses is not about to throw that tablet down on the golden calf. On the contrary, he's restraining himself from doing so. Right? That is, Moses is somebody who wants one thing and limits himself from doing it. There are two forces at least active in Moses, right? And he has to compromise in the middle of them. Somebody like Hitler doesn't compromise about anything. He wants what he wants and he takes what he takes. So now you're getting a hero and a leader figure who can be ambivalent, right? And the human possibility is beginning to be manifest. Could we follow somebody who's ambivalent? Right? And then we get a layer added to it in the Moses and Monotheism book, where he says, he kind of condenses it in a remark he made, bizarrely enough, to Salvatore Dali, where he says, Moses is flesh of sublimation, meaning Moses is somebody who is better than anybody else at sublimating the desire to have God right in front of him and to see pagan gods everywhere and believing in an invisible God. Once again, that points in the direction of dividedness. Right? Two forces active seeking a compromise. Right? The conventional patriarch that he depicts for us in group psychology never has internal division. He appears to be completely unified to the people. Now we've got a leader moving forward who is self-divided and people can respond to him. This is a great step in the civilized direction, it seems to me. And, you know, if you test the fruit of that, what would such a leader be like? That leader would be able not only to show self-division, but the leader would be able to be ironic, humorous, and make jokes. All signs of self-division, all signs of interior tension. So there are two stories about the leader. One, the conventional, Moses is the guy I told you about in group psychology. And the other, a really interesting one, Moses is a self-divided leader and people follow him nevertheless. Maybe we could reach that point. That would be really wonderful.
And of course, Moses is deeply divided in Freud's telling because he's two people.
Two people.
Yeah, that's the first division. Sure, and that's great.
And as you say in Freud's essay on the Moses of Michelangelo, Moses restrains himself, and therefore he's civilized in the sense of what Freud would later call the superego.
Yeah.
Right? Moses is able to, not only is he the projector of this intellectual religion, but he's also a father who's able to restrain himself at his own anger, and so therefore he's civilized. And surely, these things were all these father and son and similar things were taking place in Freud's head. He also saw in 1895 there was a production in Vienna of Nathan der Weise, Nathan the Wise, by the play by Lessing, and with Sonnenthal in the lead role, and that was also very well received in Vienna, especially among the Jewish community. And it was also a question of somebody who was a good father because he restrained himself. He did not act in vengeance, but he restrained himself. So he was another super good Jewish father. And again, it enters into this idea of civilization as such.
It kind of takes us back to your story about Hannibal, and whether Freud at the end of his life might have seen it a little bit differently and had more sympathy in his heart for Papa Jacob and his restraint.
Although it's interesting, you know, when you think about death by assisted suicide, Hannibal committed suicide so the Romans wouldn't get him in the end. You know, I've always thought that kind of interesting. Well, if you're talking about Sonnenthal, the great Jewish actor on the Viennese stage, here's a question I had for you, which is, it's not Jerusalem and Stratford, but Stratford and Weimar. Why is there not the same investment in Goethe? I mean, he's cited all the time, but it seems to me that Shakespeare is the enigma that fires Freud. And in Goethe is more an authority, you know, with whom he, you know, or he likes to have Goethe sort of speak through his writings, etc. But it just seems to me kind of interesting because it's not true of other people in the circle who are obsessed with Goethe, you know. Yeah. So I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
I think you're right on the head in that Freud himself, if you said, you know, who was the real inspiration for you, quite likely he would have come up with Goethe. When he won that Goethe Prize, he was just full of happiness, right? But I think Goethe was the almost the predecessor he wanted to have, but it somehow just didn't work. The emotional torque was not there. Also, another way to put it might be, as large as he was in German culture, you know, in terms of world culture, or at least Western world culture, right? Moses and Shakespeare, that's about as far as you go. So Goethe may have been a little under-ambitious.
Minor league.
The quote I recall from some, I can't cite it exactly now, is where Freud says in a footnote, behind the name of Shakespeare lies a great unknown. And that's exactly what you were saying about the Hebraic God. It's a great unknown. It's not there. It's that Goethe's known. Shakespeare is only known by this myriad world of works, but behind it we don't know anything about Shakespeare, really. I mean, who he was, what kind of a guy he was. He's almost as invisible as the deity. Yeah. So there's a certain, I liked very much that juxtaposition. I think there's something there. I'd also like to comment that there's a piece of folklore about Moses, which if I'm not mistaken, actually comes from the Arabic tradition, though it may be a Jewish midrash too, that a king had a portrait of Moses and asked a great physiognomer to come and do an analysis of this person without telling him who it was. And he looked at the face and said, well, this is a person whose personality is petty, tyrannical, lustful, and ambitious. And the king said, now I understand why Moses was the greatest of all men, because he rose above all men.
Ah, yeah. That's fascinating.
There's a tradition, I talk about this in my book too, and going back to Philo of Alexandria, again, among the sort of Hellenized Jews in antiquity, of seeing Moses as a philosophical hero who, you know, absorbing all the great learning of antiquity, is able through reason to conquer these aspects of himself. So, you know, I think there's a very long genealogy for that sort of thing.
Right. Also, we remember that in the Jewish tradition, Moses is not a tyrant, he's the liberator. And Freud also, to this day, is regarded as both the great liberator, but also as the founder of a strict dogma that became authoritarian and that no one was allowed to question. I mean, both of these pictures of Freud and of Moses remain accurate to this day.
Well, and both authorities certainly self-generated. If you take Freud's reading, of course, that the authority for the tradition is entirely self-generated. You don't have anything else except for it springs forth from the mind, to go back to Athens from Jerusalem. But now I'm wondering, or I'm led to a conclusion, which of course gets into one of the thornier issues of Moses, the Moses book, is that if we can posit this ambivalent Moses, who in fact isn't the archetypal father at all, but is about restraint and these other qualities, the portrait notwithstanding, then the murder of Moses has to be entirely linked to this issue of the trace memory, or this weird, what seems to be Lamarckian, it's often said, conservation of the memory of the original murder of the father, because it seems that Moses wasn't that, and yet the conditions were such to bring this memory forth, and then of course you're stuck in this weird morass of the book itself, which is one of the most interesting.
Which also leads you to Jesus, among other things.
Right, of course.
Comment of yours also made me wonder his analysis, his appreciation of Hannibal, and the fact that his ambivalence about Herzl and about the project of Zionism, because what you made me think of, how was, Jews with Uzis. I mean, that this is an idea that couldn't be imagined in Freud's day, but that became a reality in Israel. I mean, when we say Jerusalem, we're thinking of the old Jerusalem. You could think of Jerusalem today. What would Freud think about the tough Jew?
Well, I'll tell you one thing that will come up in my paper on Monday, which I've always found interesting. It's an anecdote, and that is, I don't know how many of you have ever read Hirschmiller's wonderful biography of Josef Breuer, but he had an encounter with a young Jewish dueling fraternity of the University of Vienna. This was one of these, kind of curious Viennese things that there was a Jewish dueling fraternity to respond to the fact that the Aryan fraternities had decided that Jews had no honor and therefore they had nothing to defend, and they refused, to deal with it. So they came up with this group, Kadima, which was a sort of early Zionist organization, but it, in essence, was initially a dueling fraternity. And Martin Freud, Freud's son, joined it. And initially, I mean, if you really want to read some interesting pages, you need to read Martin Freud's memoir of this, because first of all, what you see is a much more assimilated Viennese Jew joining a dueling fraternity at university full of all of these Eastern Jews who are, to him, like from Mars in all the way they behave, etc. But he admires them greatly precisely because they're tough. And he talks about fist fights and knife fights. He was knifed at one point. And there are these wonderful little vignettes there where he comes in with a knife wound from one of these scuffles. His father looks at him sympathetically. And who was sitting there at the table? Oskar Pfister, the Swiss vicar, who stood up and shook Martin's hand for taking a wound in such a noble cause. So this is kind of mind-boggling. But what happened was Martin was initially very worried about what his father would think about him joining this fraternity, knowing that assimilated Jews in Vienna often had very low views of Zionism, thinking that this was sort of troublemakers. And in fact, he was delighted, much to Martin's surprise, and later became one of the honorary members, one of the Alte Herren of this organization. So, in terms of the interesting aspects of Freud's character, again, what I think you often see is that fascination and an admiration for that sort of physical defense of honor. But then again, what is that? He often will talk about the fanaticism with which the Jews defended their temple and such. And this is a comment that Breuer had said to him at one point that greatly flattered him, to think that he had that tenacity. Tenacity being also an intellectual aspect of character, which he thought again made Jews so very well suited to scientific advancement, because they had basically the stamina to go through this incredibly complex and difficult process. But one of the things that emerges from this, though, that I still think is very interesting is the question of, often said that Freud needed to have an enemy. And that what is fundamental to the aspect of being a Jew in Vienna is really more than anything the sense of being in the opposition against the so-called compact majority. And when you think about his analysis of things, for example, one of the decisive steps, again, in Jewish history being the destruction of the temple, leading to a necessary sort of intellectualification of the relationship with religion, removing, the whole cultic practice of sacrifice, etc., and again, forcing it into the abstract towards rabbinical Judaism, Talmud, and things like that. Or again, you think about the Hannibal complex. Hannibal is also a great figure of kind of anomaly in the sense that what he's known for is his jihad practically against Rome and little else, right? Again, these powerful figures of opposition and that sense of a need, right, to come for the conflict, for the enemy. And in relation to, again, the intellectual aspect of Judaism that emerges into Muslim monotheism, it's not just paganism that's being discussed. It's also Christianity, of course, Catholic Christianity,
Yes.
and its use of images, and the cult of the saints, which he very cleverly, can then say is obviously a regression.
It's a throwback. Yeah.
So I mean,
he gets so much work done in so little space.
and he makes anti-Semitism appear like Christian self-hatred by the end, which I think is brilliant.
It's too good.
I'll call that flipping around that
Yes.
you were talking about, of reversals that are so characteristic. But perhaps we can suggest that it might be time for questions from the floor. If there are comments or thoughts, we'd be happy to address your concerns. Speak up. Yeah, go ahead.
It's just it's an historical question. In this year, the 350th anniversary of the Theorem excommunication of Spinoza, and these interesting comments about the source of Jewish intellectuality, and reason perhaps coming from Jerusalem. Did Freud read Spinoza? Was there any evidence of connection or familiarity there?
I can't say definitely that he did, but I would be surprised if he didn't.
I remember
a commemoration of the life of, a good life.
He had a picture on his wall of Spinoza walking.
Okay.
I remember a comment from an interview. Maybe someone asked him this in an interview. He said, "Is Spinoza an influence?" He says, "Definitely." He said, "Well, what did you read?" "Nothing." So, one of those curious things.
That's great.
Yes.
I'm very impressed by everybody, so I'm very low. But I would like to say, number one, what is the Jew and at what time in the history of Vienna? And what is going to be done with the fact? What is his reaction to a town where every human being hates the Jews? Believe me, I lived there. I lived there until I was 21, my years on afterwards, where everybody, every Jew is hated. That must have had an influence on his image of the world, himself, life, just as well. I had it. My mother was Christian, her father was Jewish, and it was a mess from beginning to end. Thank you.
Well, again, I think that goes back to the whole question of the sense of an oppositional identity. Yeah, the sense that being in the opposition is precisely, the burden of being a Jew.
May I give you just one little example? You probably know that the Pappenheims and the Freuds lived next to each other in the Wassergasse. And it was told by Freud's daughter to me that Mrs. Pappenheim said, "I really respect your husband very much, but all that dirt and all that dirt that he talks about, I cannot believe." Exactly. So there you have the image that the Viennese had of Jews.
Right. I mean, I think it also speaks to the ambivalence that we're talking about, and one of the things, of course, that makes Freud's relationship with religion in general such a strange thing is that he does set up this opposition and goes so strong against religion at the same time, of course, that he's conserving an identity in opposition to precisely Vienna at the time. And so he's really, in some ways, finding oppositions on all sides, of course, antagonizing religious Jews, but of course antagonizing secular society as well by conserving this notion of his identity. And then, of course, he has an incredibly ambivalent relationship with Vienna. He doesn't want to leave Vienna. He absolutely wants to stay. There's something there for him that he doesn't want to give up, knowing full well precisely the experience that you've articulated. And so this is...
This goes back to Spinoza, to the picture he had of Spinoza was of Spinoza being stoned by the Jews. That Spinoza was persona non grata among the Jews, but also persona non grata among the Christians, and that you can see a clear identification there.
One of the things I learned recently, investigating the history of the 1930s, is quite striking, and it's on the matter of anti-Semitism. When Hitler came to power in 1933, one would have expected that the Berlin Psychoanalytic Institute would be closed down. But my understanding is that it was not. Most of the all of the Jewish analysts were purged from the staff, and the remaining members of the staff, led by a cousin of Goering's, began work in a particular direction. The direction is quite interesting. What they said was, as if I understand them correctly, that Sigmund Freud was a genius, and he had it right. Oedipal complex, childhood sexuality, dreams, violence in the human psyche, the whole business was right, but he was right exclusively about Jews. And now the work to be done is unbelievable. Right? And
Nazi psychoanalysis.
There was just nobody like him, really, for perception of the Jewish psyche. But now there was work left to be done, and that was to come to an understanding of what the Aryan psyche was like. It was much more spirited and spiritual, and had a propensity toward purity. And they actually started to work on this to set up a kind of a parallel between the two. It's amazing. Amazing.
Well, I don't know if you've heard of, there's a book in Freud's personal library, and I probably should mention the catalog is out now of the library, if you've not heard, which is in CD-ROM, as well as a book with some essays. And you can see actual images of pages, dedications, things that he underlined. And I highly recommend this because it's very interesting for the study of Freud, but also in general for the future of such projects of intellectual history where you can actually look at what he underlines and what he's reading. But one of the things that's curious, of course, are the books that are dedicated to him, sent to him. And there was a book sent, I think it was through Eduardo Weiss, with a dedication written by Mussolini that said, to Sigmund Freud, who will make the world a better place, che renderà migliore il mondo. And this put him in a terrible situation because he was obviously supposed to acknowledge this in some way. And I can't remember what text he sent, but he just wrote, something very vague to the extent that, we recognize the culture hero or something like that. It had to do with the fact that Mussolini had helped to sponsor excavations of in the Roman Forum. So it's kind of non-committal. But again, it just shows you one of those curious things. The other thing that's interesting is the surrealists love to send their work to him. And one of the things you need to know is this material by Breton, etc., is in the Freud library, but the pages are uncut. And it says, they're dedicated to Father Freud and all of this sort of stuff. Obviously, and he made a joke about them making him a patron saint. So when you hear that he had their writings, you need to know that they were never read.
The thing he said to Dolly was just terrific. Dolly really believed that he was chronicling the unconscious, and I guess what Freud said to him when they finally met was, in your work I see ego, only ego.
Well, you remember how he said...
he liked Dolly a lot compared to André Breton and the others whom he kicked out of his office.
I don't know if you remember what Dolly said to his examiners in Spain, that they weren't competent to judge him, Who is?
Do you have a question? Yes, sir.
Edmundson had to say about Moses and the movement.
Yeah.
And also Shakespeare. No one knows anything about Shakespeare. Also the movement, like Hamlet. And it was mentioned about what's the Nazis and psychoanalysis.
Right.
And there's Marx. It's a sort of similar thing because the movement. That's what makes somebody more significant than just being a genius. Is the movement that comes out of it. And the movement doesn't come out of it unless there's a reason for it. There's a basis of that movement occurring. And so I don't know if you've written a book on it yet, but I would suggest...
I'm trying.
I'll read it.
Okay, good.
Arnie, you want to...
You'll be the guy.
In the movie Princess Marie, there's a scene in which Marie Bonaparte is with the Gestapo, and she's trying to convince the Gestapo to let her go. And she mentions, don't you know that Mussolini wrote something to Freud, and Mussolini thinks a lot of him, and well, a combination of other things, and he did leave Vienna. The other thing I wanted to mention in terms of Goethe, I mean, the story is that Freud gave up his wish to be a politician and a lawyer because he heard someone read Goethe's essay on nature, and that is often mentioned as the defining career choice in his life. It's interesting, on the other hand, what you say about his relationship to Goethe, but at least when he was at that age, it's certainly very important to him.
Yeah, he said that, and I have to admit, when I first heard it, I ran out and got the essay on nature, because I thought I'm going to learn all kinds of things. I have to admit, I kind of fell asleep halfway through. This is me and Goethe, but I guess I think he wanted so much to have a connection with Goethe and to be the second Goethe, but he wanted bigger things. And then
well, it's interesting because he had a similar relationship with Feuerbach at one point when he was young, and Feuerbach, he refers to him as a father also of sort, and it's the father who overturns religion in this case, and so he builds his way up, if you want to talk about overturning religion, moving his way up till he, not just Shakespeare, but gets to Moses.
Right. There may be questions behind me, sir.
Yeah. You guys were also afraid. I don't have anything directly responding to what you said, I think, but I wanted to ask a question about potentially another connection between Freud and Judaism. I think it's another connection. I feel like saying in Freudian style, what follows is pure speculation. Is there any sense that, I mean, I have the sense that Freud's definition of eros, or of love, particularly in his later work, insofar as it involves the multiplying of differences in order to organize, has something to do with what happens at the beginning of the Torah, that is, the action of Genesis. And played against that is a sense of difference as pure destruction, or difference itself as somehow being destructive, which is one aspect of his definition of the death drive. The other aspect of the definition of the death drive, which I've never been able to harmonize with this first one, is, of course, inertia. And that you could think of as a backsliding to familiar gods or familiar experiences. So, you see that in the Exodus narrative. But you also see the aspect of difference itself as somehow being destructive in, for example, what mankind does before the flood. They seem to be doing, the same verbs are used, for what God has done, multiplying, but, this is somehow bad rather than good. So I'm wondering if any of you have the sense that, Freud, how involved he might have been with these motifs in Genesis. If he was, maybe he wasn't.
Yerushalmi implies that this is always sort of just right there for him to grasp on and use. One can certainly take issue with that, but he seems to imply that that he knows this and has it as at his command. But of course, he's trying to do other things with it.
He describes that he uses Empedocles and Plato, so he doesn't say, he never mentions, Genesis in this regard.
I was just wondering, I know a little bit more about Moses than the book that Freud wrote, but how does he deal with Moses' anger? Because throughout Moses' history, he displays a tremendous amount of anger when he kills the Egyptian, then when he punishes the Jews for the idol, when he has a challenge with Korach where there are 14,000 people killed at once, and he displays a tremendous amount of anger, and you characterize him as being killed. However, he's killed by his own actions because of not following instructions. As a prophecy, he was told to go to the rock, and he hits the rock, which again is a display of anger. How does Freud deal with that?
In one case, really, through what we might both agree is distortion. That is, it's pretty clear to me, looking at the Michelangelo sculpture. When I saw it in Rome, it was in St. Peter and Chains Church, and you had to have a 5 lira piece to turn on the lights. And when we run out of 5 lira pieces, you just kind of hang around in the dark until somebody came along to illuminate the most consequential, one of the most consequential sculptures conceivable. But when it was illuminated, what it showed to me was Moses, angry, as you say, about to throw those tablets down. But Freud absolutely insists that he is dealing with anger and ultimately suppressing it, and that he's not going to express it. He says that this is what he sees there, and it's what Michelangelo put there, and that is that.
And that's what's interesting is he talks about himself in that essay being unnerved by Moses' angry stare, feeling like one of the backsliding Hebrews, So, and that you can obviously read many things,
Yeah.
But in fact, Pope Julius II's tomb, of which the Moses is a part, really, I think, to be fair to everyone, that Freud's interpretation was a fantasy, and the fact that Moses is angry and is about to is thinking of smashing the tablets in that particular sculpture, which is basically a Neoplatonic kind of embodiment of energy more than anything else, and it was to the people in the 16th century. I mean, I think the people in the 16th century had it right when they said, when they expressed that it was, obviously it's a figure filled with potential, but if you think of Michelangelo's Victory, that's just as violent, just the same kind of thing. I mean, you have to think in terms of Michelangelo's corpus of works. And so I don't think that, I think all the things about the Moses being angry or wanting to even associating anything from Exodus with that statue is a bit ahistorical.
And to go to the history card, which I'll play, why not?
This is celebrity poker.
It feels like it. This goes directly to your question, is that throughout that book in particular, Freud plays fast and loose with his primary document. And so he's looking at Genesis, and at times he's citing it and drawing out and saying, aha, this is what happened. And at times he's saying, this is clearly revision because these people have a second Moses and they've already moved forward and they need to somehow make this all work. And as a result, he's able to sort of smooth these things over where he wants to do it.
On the other hand, he does recognize one thing about the nature of monotheism, and this has been discussed a great deal, especially in the work of Jan Assmann, who's written very interestingly on Freud's Moses, and that is the problem of intolerance. That raising the ante from some form of henotheism to a sort of strict monotheism means that the religion becomes inherently intolerant of other creeds, of other cults, I should say rather. And Freud recognizes that. And this is where, I take exception to the reading that Edward Said gave of Freud's Moses, where he wants to sort of celebrate it as a kind of, heterogeneous view of identity and all of this, but forgetting that intolerance is built into it. So that negativity, the struggle with difference, is kind of encoded already right there at the level of once you make what Assmann calls the mosaic distinction, that our religion is true and all others are therefore false, that what you create is fundamentally a counter-religion. And so, that's the kind of dynamic that Freud recognizes and again, I think ascribes in part to the severe character of the original Moses, which is why he gets himself killed.
I think, if I remember right, when he gets killed, Freud's quite clear about articulating the reason the first Moses gets killed is because of his very hard, angry, impatient, severe manner. And of course,
aristocratic manner.
Aristocratic. So it's not surprising. And so he concerns, and he admits throughout, I characterize him as playing fast and loose with historical sources, but of course throughout the book he's also telling you that he knows he's doing this and that he's also ambivalent about it and that he understands that there's problems in this.
There's some questions back here. Chris there. Please, in the corner.
We've heard a very erudite discussion of Freud's theories of identification and disidentification. As a clinician, I guess I was expecting to hear more about the source of Freud's imagination internally in terms of his personal history.
Yes.
I was trying to hint at that when I was talking about Freud's absorption of these photographs in his study. Documentary photographs published in printed books with large editions. And, I can give you a case in point if you're interested, or I could just, my idea is that these particular photographs, 19th century archaeological photographs, I don't know if you have any before you, but were especially easily internalized because they were meant as documentation. In other words, whoever looked at those books, and those still, students who look at those books in the present day, are looking at the sculpture. For example, you see the Vatican Aphrodite, and she's totally restored. She's seamless, you know, that her head and arm are reattached and everything in representation. And so I think that, in my view, those images had a great deal to do with Freud's not just Freud, but Freud is a particularly important reader of these books because he dealt with the unconscious. But that those illustrations are particularly present, and they're very mutable, and they're dreamlike in many, many ways, and that they played an active part in his imagination. And they also had to do with a kind of sculpture come to life, a kind of, I don't know how many of you know the book by Max Aram, Das Weib der antiken Kunst. And it's about female nude statues in Greek and Roman art.
No, I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. And in my view, those images when you stop to look at them and critique them and pay them due attention, they're very, very present in the imagination of anyone, I think, who studied or still studies. They're still published again and again in the world of archaeology and art history.
One source of Freud's imagination that may have some resonance for you as a clinician, at least, as I understand it, is something that may be commonplace now, but was very effective for him, and that he associates with Schiller in the interpretation of dreams. A friend of his writes him a letter and says, I'm just not getting any ideas. I can't come up with anything. And Freud writes back and for all purposes says, using the parlance of, the latter part of the 19th century, 1890, 1900 for him, what's happening for all purposes is that your ego is cutting off your creative flow too quickly. What Schiller recommends, and implicitly what I, Sigmund Freud, do, is to just let it fly completely. And then worry about it later. I just, I write, and then I apply my judgment a little bit later on. Well, one of the fabulous things about Freud is that you see that, even when he's on the way to becoming the great authority, Sigmund Freud, he still seems to write his books by letting fly, and the judgment doesn't always come back there and winnow out everything. So you have that amazing footnote in Civilization and Its Discontents about how mankind gained control over fire. How did that happen? Right. Well, in general, I guess I just got to tell it because, in general, when fire would strike a bough and the bough would come down, there'd be fire in front of an individual, a male individual. That individual would urinate on it in order to put it out in a homosexual contest of some sort. It's not, as I mentioned, it's not clear. There's evidence for this, he says, by the way, in Rabelais and elsewhere. Then there became, and this has resonance to some of the things that we've been trying to think of about Moses. Then there comes along the guy who says, I'm going to restrain myself from the satisfaction of urinating out the fire and making a heck of a smell if my experience in Boy Scouts is accurate. I'm going to take this home and do something with it. Well, it's marvelous not only for its resonance in this business of, the hero of sublimation, Moses, but also this is somebody who, despite his real interest in being a figure of authority and having people who believed in his doctrine, would just let fly in those wonderful speculative ways and then not take it all out. It creates great tension.
But he also destroyed so many of his notes. It's,
but what he left us with is just mind-blowing stuff that he would say, especially in the footnotes. The footnotes is, if you're looking for the Freudian compositional unconscious, there's a piece of it. They're terrific.
I think part of the problem too is how do you extricate what we know of his childhood, which is always unfolding within the context of this scientific endeavor, and thinking particularly in the case of the interpretation of dreams. There is a case where he goes through many childhood memories that are absolutely fascinating and have clear linkages with texts that he's writing both for the interpretation of dreams and later, thinking of the dream, for example, about the bird-headed figures, which seems to have a kind of visual image from the Philipson Bible, of these Egyptian figures that, he talks about their carrying away his mother and his recognition there of a sort of sexual attraction to his mother, all because of the verb vögeln, which, and then that carries over later in the Leonardo study when he interprets, Leonardo's memory of the bird, and in relation to his mother and all of this. It goes all the way back to the Egyptian Mut, So what I would say is, in terms of his personal imagination, you see a sort of complex of images that have deep resonance with him that reverberate in the studies that are going on, especially early on when he first extends you think about the first decade, in the 1900s, where you go from the interpretation of dreams then to, the joke books, psychopathology of everyday life, and then writing about literature, etc. I mean, there's this kind of big bang going on of extension of this theory all over the place. But what unifies it very often are these personal memories that you can, get there. And so, for example, I would say the Hannibal issue is one, again, where you can see something that he talks about in his essay on the psychology of the schoolboy, which is, it's precisely those initial, imagos of the parents and the siblings that you grow through school, and you go to school to get substitutes for those, or to feed them further, right, with these encounters, so that I would say it's very hard to link, or rather to separate, what is the personal source of imagination from what we see in his intellectual project, because precisely that, in the interpretation of dreams, what is it he says? I've analyzed, I've come up with this theory in part through analyzing thousands of dreams of patients, but I'm not going to use them because they're neurotics. I will use, the dreams of a relatively sane person myself. And that's a very curious evidentiary gesture that's made, right? But one in which he can then control all of the factors of presentation in terms of what preceded the dream and all that. But it's an enormous risk in which his own passion, his anti-Semitism, his German nationalism from an early era in his life, all of these things come to the fore. The memories, again, of sexual feelings toward his mother and all of this, all comes welling up, but within the structure, of the dream book. So. She's been very patient. We have to.
Well, I first want to say that Freud refers to Spinoza. He says, "My fellow unbeliever Spinoza." So there's just I'm forgetting what I say, whether that is. But just to go back.
I think that comes from Heine too.
I
think it's a riff on Heine, right?
But I wanted to respond to what you were saying about Osman's work on the Mosaic distinction and Moses sort of as the origin of intolerance, or the Mosaic distinction as the origin of intolerance of Egypt in falsehood, Israel, and truth. And I think actually in his more recent work, Osman has revised that earlier thesis, and I think Eric Santner has taken that in a really interesting direction, which maybe speaks to the subject today, which is not that the Mosaic distinction is the ultimate origin of difference, whether historically or within Freud's setup, but that Freud situates it, and Freud gets at in his whole work, the difference that is at the heart of everyday experience, at the heart of the psyche and the human subject. So that there's a sense, I think, with his story of Moses and Mosaic monotheism, that there's a messiness at the heart of every supposed singularity. There's a messiness that generates abstract ideals. They're not so pure. They're messy and different and multiple and mixed blood even as he's talking about the singular origin of, the singular story of multiple stories, but he's constructing a story of Mosaic monotheism. So I think that also gets at what you were saying, Edmundson, about that being a source for imagination as well. So it's not just intolerance, but sort of what everyday experience is like. And of course, he does privilege the Jewish subject in that last book. But I just sort of brought that all together. It's not just intolerance, but
I don't mean to give that impression. In fact, Osman also tried not to give that impression. And one of the things that, if you're interested in Osman's work, he came out with a book. I think this says a lot to his credit as an intellectual. A lot of people were offended by this, where this could go. It could be potentially anti-Semitic. It could be, also a lot of Christian theologians in Germany were offended. So one of the things that he did do was to publish a book called The Mosaic Distinction, revisiting the debate, nuancing his arguments, and then he puts as an appendix several articles by his critics. He obviously was wanting to treat this, with some dignity, because it's a very obviously incendiary, potentially kind of characterization among
I find myself often stuck on those tablets that are described in the Moses of Michelangelo, and I sort of go over it and try to understand it. Today, an analogy was suggested between Moses' role in moving the Israelites from idols and from actual idols and physical images to having a more intellectual, a more sublimated, a more representational idea of an abstract God. And that there's a relationship also between that and Freud trying to create the sense of a kind of an inner space within which you could find these various forces of the ego-id and superego functioning. And I found myself thinking about that image of the tablets. And one of the things that struck me is that there is, in both of those parts of the analogy, a kind of a transitional process that has to occur. And that both Moses and Freud are the proponents of not only the end result, but the process. So that in that sense, I was struck suddenly by the fact that the tablets represent the word, the more abstract, the secondary process, but at the same time they are these physical things which can break. They're actually stone objects, so that they are also, you know, the thing presentation as well as the word presentation, the primary process and the secondary process. And it just struck me that sort of symbolically, not necessarily to say that this is what really was happening, but that Freud had to protect those and Moses had to protect those, because those are the place where the transition occurs from the concrete to the symbolic, which is also what we do as clinicians, as trying to help our patients move themselves from the concrete issues where they're often stuck to the more symbolic issues, which allow them a space within which they can understand and work through problems.
Yeah.
I talk about this in the paper that I'm giving on Levinas and Freud, specifically in talking about the tablets and then the Torah as an instantation of a tension between what I refer to as an immanent understanding that's actually contextually bound and material, object-like, and then a transcendent understanding. And that with the Torah, what you have is something that implies the transcendent, because of course it was revealed through revelation and given by divine authority, and yet it's also an immanent object that doesn't just speak to when Moses gave it, but speaks to all time and actually speaks to all contexts. And of course, in some Talmudic commentary, it's said that every interpretation of the Torah that could be ever offered was already given. And so you have this interesting tension between the two, but of course it's also time-bound in this way that it can be destroyed. And one of the things that's interesting to me about what Levinas does with Moses as opposed to what Freud does, Freud, of course, then takes the immanent nature of this text, but does create a transcendent mechanism. The transcendent mechanism isn't unlike evolution. In fact, evolution is something you could look at it today and understand how it worked 80,000 years ago. Similarly, maybe not that far back, one could think of the psychic mechanisms of how consciousness works, and you could then do analysis today, and as Freud does, apply it back to times in antiquity where you don't have historical evidence, but you do have the psychoanalytic practice to be able to recuperate and make a plausible historical reconstruction of what occurred. Well, it's interesting because he's conserved a transcendent mechanism to allow for his immanent reading right there. Levinas does precisely the opposite, and one could think about the way he's writing after the Second World War and attempts to rehinge it to a transcendence so that even if all Jews were gone, or if there was only one Jew left, you could still, even if the tablets are broken, you could still get them. You can still have access to them because there's that external authority. I don't think that can happen in Freud's model, although I suppose it's always up here at some level.
Yeah. Freud, if you asked Freud, what's at the center of Judaism, he would surely say belief in the invisible God, but also, as you say, the tablets, the text, thing to read. But I think if you asked Freud what's at the center of psychoanalysis, despite the wishes of us literary critical types, he would say that it's not a textual relationship. It's a relationship between two people in a room talking about something that's not there, and that's a huge human achievement.
On the other hand, I would say this, which is he's trying to read, and you think about dream images and the primary process sort of things that are so important in the whole explosion of the dream as a sort of source of imagination, constantly trying to explain how it is that psychoanalysis can kind of find some form of correction or sense of center for its interpretive movements. This is one of the things he has to do when he distinguishes himself from ancient dream interpreters, is to try and find what makes it more scientific and not merely sort of a kind of interesting, like card readers and whatnot kind of way of making a living. And what's very clear is it's the metaphor of archaeological decipherment that is, again, linguistic, that often controls the way in which he tries to say that there is a way in which we can say there is a consensus about dream symbolism. And this is something that runs, unfortunately, and it's hard to control, but he'll insist on it even as the analogy is awfully clearly not relevant or not entirely, doesn't entirely hold water. And in that sense, I've always found it interesting, in which, again, the linguistic constantly arises as a controlling metaphor or a controlling, analogy, I suppose.
One of the amazing things about Freud, if I understand him correctly, is that as his thinking about therapy evolves, he never loses touch with the interpretive dimension that you're describing. But of course, at a certain point, this is another whole dimension of the authority question, the transference becomes the center of therapy. Right? So that it's very much about an interpersonal relationship that's based on certain kinds of illusions, right? Certain kinds of projections. And interpretation still matters there, but it's less text-based and more between two human beings. And one of the things I hugely admire about Freud, one of the things that also begins to qualify his own patriarchal sense of self, is that for patient after patient, time after time, when he became a transference analyst, he was the person who stood in for the figure of authority and was dismantled, deconstructed, demystified by the person sitting across from him and turned into an ordinary, everyday human being, because that's perhaps, if I glean for it correctly, that's how you know when the patient is sane, when he just thinks of you, the therapist on the other side, as another human being with sorrows and joys and pleasures and pains, and no longer as the subject who's supposed to know. And that's an emotional exchange as well as an interpretive one. And I think it has a great resonance, not only in terms of interpretation, but also in terms of Freud's willingness to learn how to play with this patriarchal ideal that he set up for himself and learn how to release it time after time in therapy, only to restore it again in various ways in his
It's important to note, though, he does admit to HD he hates it when someone in transfers makes him the mother.
Right. That would be a lot to ask from Siggy.
Well, I was thinking about Freud's idea of this ambivalent leader, and he was probably not yet a democratic leader. In fact, this is not anyone that responds to letters or is influenced in any way. And I was thinking about Freud's vast correspondence and how it often seems like, although he's writing to another person, he's really not. There's very little response to others. But he uses them as a sounding board. But it's not an interplay between two minds. And I wonder what you all thought of this aspect of Freud's authoritarianism, or possibly his unwillingness to be mutually penetrated mentally.
I think it's a great description of a lot of the letters I've read, which is far from all of them.
Yeah.
But I think that one of the signal events in Freud's life was the amazing sorrow and disillusionment with Jung, the person with whom he could exchange ideas, he felt, and then that failed. Yeah. And he sort of, raised himself up as the great authority, and he decided, not Jung, but Ernest Jones, who does what I tell him to do. It was a fight his whole life with this authoritarian streak. But there's so many other dimensions of him. He's the patriarch who teaches us to put an end to patriarchy, but he'll never say as much. It's a great tension.
I think we could go on. We'll have one more question, please.
Yes, I would like to address your discussing the importance of the visual and the translation into the verbal, because
I didn't catch the last part. His translation into the verbal. Okay.
Yeah, of the visual and the importance of studying photographs. And could you put that into a culturally contextual thing? Because photography was newer, and I would say that. And the other thing is that it had already been assigned a psychological value. And, for example, Rodenbach, who included photographs in his novel, Rouge Mort. He included photographs, he published his book with photographs, and said that the photographs are the
nostalgic art. And so I'd like to put that into the Freudian
Is that, okay, I can give you an exemplum gratis of this, the way I'm thinking about this. And that is that, you know, in art history they say if you want to prove your point, never illustrate it. So I don't have to have any illustrations today. But a photograph, for example, this is about Freud's essay on the Medusa, and a photograph of the Rondanini Medusa, the one in the Glyptothek in Munich, was published by Furtwängler in an arresting image of a horizontal facing page to a vertical page of text. And it fills the page in a very, very powerful manner, and with very high contrast and definition and chiaroscuro. And when Freud wrote his essay on the Medusa's head in 1922, yes, he did know a plaster copy of the Rondanini Medusa from the Gemälde Gallery at the art school in Vienna. But the photograph, in my view, is a much more expressive reproduction and was present in his visual field much more frequently, accompanied by a vivid text. It's almost as though in those old archaeology books, it's almost as though the text of the book is an elaborated caption to the photographs. The photographs are so important. And whether, I think it was very important for him whether it remained in his optical unconscious or conscious mind. And according to Freud, okay, we all know a decapitated Medusa's head represented castration, and not only that. But, quote, if the Medusa's head takes the place of a representation of the female genitals, or rather if it isolates their horrifying effects from their pleasure-giving ones, it may be recalled that displacing the genitals is familiar in other connections as an apotropaic act. Indeed, the male viewer's reaction to the Medusa head results in just that. Quote, the sight of Medusa's head makes the spectator stiff with terror, turns him to stone. Observe that we have here once again the same origin from the castration complex and the same transformation of affect, for becoming stiff means an erection. Now, Sarah Kaufman has argued that, quote, the inseparable blend of horror and pleasure, the thrill of the sight of Medusa, that the sight of Medusa brings to a male is based, in Freud's thought, on the fact that the power of a woman's genital always has its apotropaic counterpart in the erection of a male. Furtwängler's text, which accompanies and describes the photograph of the Rondanini Medusa, emphasizes precisely those issues that would concern Freud, namely the congealing of blood in the mortal viewer of Medusa and the terrible dentolated mouth of the sculpture in Munich. And Furtwängler states that the Rondanini Medusa represented not Goethe's stare of death, quote unquote, but rather a demonic creature at whose aspect the blood of mortals congealed in their veins and was turned them to stone. But even if the final effect was an apotropaic erection, it was the threatening, slightly open mouth of the decapitated head of Medusa that looms out to readers of the Denkmäler in a gripping reference to the photograph. And here's the caption. The strictly symmetrical design also increases the demoniacal effect. The evenly balanced, overspread wings, Medusa has wings coming out of her head, form a horizontal mass, which has a gloomy, oppressive effect on the whole. The lines converge in the manner of an isosceles triangle and meet where the terrible expression of the whole is concentrated in the half-open mouth. Indeed, Furtwängler directed the reader's attention to the illustrated form from the beginning, with the idea that, quote unquote, most of the expression is in the mouth, which is unusually large and slightly open, the upper teeth being visible. The photograph, then, I'm saying, and its textual counterpart, it's like phrases in the text of the caption that illustrates it, had both agency and reflective power in the cultural systems that supported and received Freud's theories. Without reducing Freud's reading and viewing of Furtwängler's Denkmäler to a simple formula of cause and effect, we can appreciate the way in which published photographs and their art historical captions, which can be at varying lengths and qualities, ensembles of words and images together, entered the visual imagination, both individual and collective, of modernity. And we can also assume that these images had always had latent as well as manifest content, as did the content of these art history and archaeology books. Any art historical writing has latent as well as manifest content and can be interpreted as such.
Well, I could link photography to theater, since that's been one of our concerns, in that one of the collections of photographs that Freud owned was the Iconographie photographique de la Salpêtrière, which was this collection Charcot's clinic made of hysterical patients in the various phases of their florid acts, florid hysterical fits. And what's interesting to me is, of course, there was, when he studied with Charcot, he was aware of this whole theater of hysteria, this sort of highly, staged kind of way in which the patients were made to perform their hysteria for the sake of scientific demonstration, but subsequently people began to feel, of course, that there was a tremendous manipulation of these people for, spectacle. Yeah. And what's interesting is to think about this. At least in the later disposition of his rooms, Freud sitting in his chair sees that picture of Charcot giving his lesson with a woman swooning, before the class of men sitting there studying her, And what's interesting to me as I thought about this is the inherently untheatrical way in which, the analytic situation is created, and he refuses to ever demonstrate it. When he lectures, in the introductory lectures, he makes it very clear it cannot be witnessed by a third party, right? And yet, there is this germ of theatricality in the fact that, first of all, it begins in cathartic therapy, with this connection with the notion of catharsis, and the two sort of controlling metaphors. On the one hand, the archaeological reconstruction of memory, but on the other, what do you reconstruct? Scenes of memory, which then are re-experienced almost with that remove of a spectator, right? So there are interesting ways in which you can see, the image, of the hysteric, photographically, being something that in a way he's almost shying away from, but he still can't escape that kind of element of performance.
And you of all people will realize too that in Emmanuel Levy's books, if you take Emmanuel Levy's book on on Greek sculpture, the story of Greek sculpture, when you get to Hellenistic sculpture, you have exactly a parallel situation to what Charcot is doing in Paris. Namely, generations of students have received the fact that Hellenistic sculpture deals with the personal, the emotional, deals with states of drunkenness, desire, etc., etc. And when you open Emmanuel Levy's book on Hellenistic sculpture, you see all these sample paradigms of, like the Barberini faun and all these works of sculpture that are then analyzed as to the emotional state of the mythological character. What, of course, they're representations of representations of representations.
Because you mentioned Charcot. If you read young Freud's letter from Paris to Martha Bernays describing Charcot's office and the antiquities and the rugs and the screw, I think you'll see that was the model for Freud.
Yeah, the museum.
His consulting room full of antiquities.
Yeah, it's well known.
But he didn't have a monkey.
What?
Freud did not have a monkey.
But I think Charcot influenced his aesthetic.
Yeah.
And his office later on, although people don't comment on that.
Yeah,
I think you're
they
right.
do.
Right.